Hello, Janginis. Before we get started, Rich and I want to let you in on some even more exciting updates for our Patreon subscribers.
As you know, Patreon is a site where listeners can pledge a small monthly amount, either $5 or $10, to support the cost of bringing you your favorite podcast. All patrons get early access to new CutOff Jeans episodes before they're released to the public.
But the most exciting new perk is that all of our patrons will be able to listen to an exclusive bonus episode of the podcast every other week. Topics include personal stories that I'm not ready to share publicly, conversations with family and friends.
And sometimes we'll devote an entire episode to other subjects we love, like musical theater or classic television.
Rich and I enjoy bringing you the CutOff Jeans podcast, and it would mean so much if you would consider supporting our labor of love.
Just go to patreon.com/cutoffjeanspodcast.
Thank you so much, my Janginis.
And now, on with the show.
Is your family tree a mystery? Are you fascinated by genealogy? Well, hip, hip, hooray, let's talk DNA with Julie.
The truth is in your genes.
In CutOff Jeans.
Welcome to CutOff Jeans, the podcast that helps you find your truth using nothing but DNA. I'm Julie Dixon-Jackson. I'm a genetic genealogist, henceforth known as a Gen Genie.
And I am Richard Castle, the co-host and producer of this podcast. How are you doing today, Julie?
I am fine. Thank you very much.
I'm like just starting to do my taxes. And I mean, when I say that, I don't mean do my taxes because I pay somebody to do it because I just can't figure it out anymore. I'm a college-educated man, and I look at those forms, and it's like gobbledygook to me.
So we recently got fired by our accountants.
Oh, no. Really? You got fired by them?
We got fired by that. Well, so the office is shrinking.
Okay.
One of the main accountants there is leaving, so they decided that this was the time to cut some people loose, and apparently we are not that
lucrative.
Their favorites.
What's happening with DNA, Julie?
Oh, I wanted to start. I recorded an episode of the Murderous Roots podcast. I've been on that one before, with Denise and Zelda, and I recorded this part, this one that was just released this week. Months ago. I'd actually forgotten that I did it, and it's a mini-sode that they do. Because what they do is they talk about famous serial killers or murderers and what they did, and then Denise goes back and does their genealogy and talks about what's in their tree and tries to figure out how it all happened in the first place. Yeah. And I've been on that show before explaining genetic genealogy and why it's so important in genealogy. And but I also recorded the story about my second great-grandmother's brother who murdered his wife on the goldfields. I think you remember that.
Yes.
We talked about that at some point. So I told that story on their podcast, and it is out now. So it's called Murderous Roots. Go listen to it. It's really fun. Okay, so adoptees and MPEs/NPEs and donor-conceived people have enough issues as it is. An entry from the Journal of Theoretical Medicine came up with something recently that just kind of adds another layer to this whole crazy identity crisis thing.
Oh, goody.
Yay. So an entry from the Journal of Theoretical Medicine and Bioethics is prompting outrage from women on social media. Not just women, by the way. It's not a feminist thing. It's a humanist thing. After theorizing that bodies of vegetative or brain-dead female patients could be utilized as whole-body gestational surrogates.
What?
Yeah. It was an article published in November of 2022, entitled Whole Body Gestational Donation, and it floats the concept of utilizing vegetative women's entire bodies as surrogates for prospective parents who wish to have children but cannot or prefer not to gestate.
I'm a little sick to my stomach about hearing this. This is really, this is like sci-fi, futuristic, bad stuff. And
Yes, so I know.
I'm trying to figure out how this could ever be legal. I mean, are you saying that that's something that you could opt in if you're going to go in for like
Yes.
surgery or something?
It's something, it would be in the realm of organ donation.
I see. Or like a do not resuscitate order or something, like go ahead and use my
Yes.
body to gestate somebody else's child.
For 9 months, a living human. So the article was written by Anna Smajdor. I don't know if that pronounced that correctly, a professor of practical philosophy at the University of Oslo, Norway. The article proposes that it may be viable to utilize the donated bodies of women for gestational purposes in the same manner as donated organs are used. I suggest if we are happy to accept organ donation in general, the issues raised by whole body gestational donation are differences of degree rather than substantive new concerns, she writes in her abstract. As with many surrogacy arrangements, commissioning parents may prefer to create an embryo for implantation using their own gametes or those of donors. Thus, impregnation could be a surgical affair preceded and followed by appropriate hormonal therapy to ensure maximal chance of success.
Oh my goodness. I'm just so, I'm beside myself. I'm literally beside myself.
It's like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. That's what it feels like to me.
I'm trying to think of how I could rationalize this as being something that would be okay. And the only time I could think of that it would be if we were in serious underpopulation or something happened where people could not bear children, and that we needed.
If we were in a Handmaid's Tale situation,
exactly, or some kind of horrible post-apocalyptic. There aren't enough people to populate the planet, and Lord knows that is not the case. We have more people than we can deal with at this point, and I guess you could make the argument that a surrogate is pretty much making the same decision. About carrying someone's child for them. But I don't know. There's something really icky about them being brain dead and doing it.
Right. So let's talk about the difference between PVS and brain death. So PVS is a permanent vegetative state. Because the brainstem is not impacted, those in PVS may still be able to breathe on their own and demonstrate some forms of consciousness, including opening their eyes, experiencing sleep-wake cycles, or making facial expressions. Think Terry Schiavo.
Okay.
Patients may recover from a vegetative state, but it is classified as persistent or permanent after a window of time has passed. Brain death, on the other hand, however, is the loss of neurological functions following a serious brain trauma or injury, According to the National Kidney Foundation, patients diagnosed as brain dead have no brain reflexes and are unable to breathe on their own. Brain death is considered legal death. In Smajdor's theory, the women impacted by PVS or brain death would be kept functionally alive as long as they are gestating, but she compares this to traditional organ donation. Prolonging ventilation and somatic survival in brain-dead patients is undoubtedly a disturbing prospect. Whole body gestational, it involves treating the patient's dead body as a means to an end rather than an end in itself. The patient moves from being the focus of medical concern to being a repository of tissues that can be used to benefit others. The prolongation of the ventilation period exacerbates our awareness of this, she writes. Yet, this is already a part of our organ donation process. Organ donors are almost invariably patients who are already being ventilated as part of their medical treatment. If the patient is deemed to be a suitable organ donor, ventilation will be continued along with other interventions to ensure that the organs will be maintained for transplant in optimal condition. Thus, we already prolong ventilation in order to facilitate organ donation, but not by 9 months.
This is apples and oranges as far as I'm concerned, because in my mind, being an organ donor is something that is necessary, and it helps somebody who is ill or has to live, but it doesn't create new life. In other words, you're saving somebody and giving them a better life. You're not creating a new child.
Right. And keeping in mind that as an adoption reform advocate or an advocate for changes in reproductive laws and stuff like that, once again, never in this article is the fact that the babies that are produced from this practice would be very much impacted for their entire lives, just as we are as donor-conceived people, as NPEs, and as adoptees.
I mean, that goes without saying.
Yes.
But I mean, maybe I don't understand the science of it, but I would imagine, I mean, I know when women are pregnant, as you probably know, that there are certain things you do with your diet, what you can eat, what you can drink, and how you sleep, and all of that. How are they going to even try to mimic that in someone who can't move?
Exactly, because it's already been proven that a baby bonds with its biological mother in utero.
Right. Oh
there are things that happen. We know our mother. When we are born, we are looking for our mother. That is why we do immediate skin-to-skin contact. That's where we are immediately comforted. How are they going to do that with a brain-dead corpse?
This just sounds to me like I'm picturing the movie Aliens, when all of those people were sort of imprisoned by the alien just as to gestate more aliens. Yeah. And that's what it feels like to me. And I get that really icky feeling about it. And
well, people who are desperate to have a child are going to have a better feeling about it than we are, because they feel it is their right. Because they cannot produce a child on their own, they feel that it is their right to get a child in whatever way is going to cure what ails them, as opposed to getting therapy for that trauma. We often feel like we're born as a remedy for somebody's trauma. And are born with a job. Yeah. So there's that. Also, I wanted to mention one more thing, because this article talks about the feminist outrage. Smashdor similarly theorizes that the bodies of brain-dead males could potentially be used to gestate surrogate embryos as well. What? She suggests that brain-stem dead men could also have the potential to gestate, meaning that the pool of potential donors is further increased, and that certain feminist concerns might thus be assuaged. The prospect of male pregnancy is not, as many would imagine, fanciful or a piece of science fiction, adding that the liver is a promising implantation site because of its excellent blood supply. She concludes the article by claiming that the concepts outlined in her journal entry could only be seen as outrageous if traditional cadaveric organ donation process is also called into question. No. As you said, apples and oranges. The entry has caused an uproar on social media, especially amongst women's rights advocates. No, not just amongst women's rights advocates, amongst adoptees,
human
NPEs,
beings,
and donor-conceived people. Yes. It's once again completely keeping us out of the equation and the trauma that we already have, and they just want to produce more traumatized people.
This idea about producing people like we are a commodity, rather than something special is
domestic
really,
infant supply.
It just really upsets me. And I don't have children, but and I feel for people who want them so badly, but there are certainly other avenues to pursue or to accept when you can't.
Certainly. Yes, exactly. To accept and to deal with that wound on your own, instead of creating another one in another human that you created. So yeah, I thought that was fun.
Wow, that's quite an ethical dilemma.
It is. It is.
The more that we are advanced in science, the more questions it raises in terms of, yes, just because we can do it doesn't mean we should do it.
Correct.
Why don't we take a break?
Okay.
If you're enjoying our podcast, please subscribe, rate, and review, or consider supporting us on our Patreon page, patreon.com/Cutoff Jeans Podcast. Now back to Julie and me.
All right, let's really quickly talk about the concept in DNA of outliers, meaning people who match people higher or lower than they should, but the match is correct. Okay, so a lot of times people will ask me a lot, like, why do I share this much with somebody? And my brother, who is related to them in the same way, only shares this much with somebody. And normally it's just, it's not that different, but we inherit different amounts of DNA from each of our parents. So that is completely normal. There is one thing that has always bothered me in my particular tree. I have a cousin named Graham who is a second cousin once removed, and I match him at 259 centimorgans. That's a really high match.
Okay.
Adversely, my brother, who has exactly the same DNA, paternal DNA as me, exactly the same, only matches him at 55 centimorgans. I share over 200 more centimorgans than my brother does with this person who is a second cousin once removed to both of us. That is concerning. And I've looked many times to see why that could be. More so, I stopped trying to figure it out when I realized that my brother and I share exactly the same paternal lineage. And so nothing in the tree could explain it. So when you look at the match page, where it tells you the amount of shared centimorgans you have with them, there's in blue, it's underlined. Like you share so-and-so this amount of centimorgans, and then you can click through it. And then there's a table that shows the percentage of the time people share that amount of centimorgans with that relationship.
Yeah, and what relationship you might be, right? Like a second cousin.
Yes, and it gives you like what possibilities there are of what kind of relative they are. And of course, obviously the higher ones are at the top and it goes down. But next to each section, it says the percentage of people that share that same amount with that same relationship. So Graham, who is a known second cousin, shares 55 centimorgans, second cousin once removed, 55 centimorgans with Rob.
Rob is your brother.
Yes, Rob is my brother. And it says that being a second cousin once removed at 55 centimorgans is a 27% possibility.
Okay.
It's still a possibility, and it's a rather high possibility.
Yeah.
On mine, being 259 centimorgans is only a 9% possibility, but it's a possibility. So neither of those, even though I'm the outlier, obviously, because I'm at 9%. So I am certainly on the lower end of possibilities, but it's still there. And it just goes to show that once you get beyond cousins, the bracket of possible sharing widens considerably. Mm-hmm. And at third cousins, you may not match at all. My brother has third cousins that match him that do not match me, and vice versa.
That's so wild. Yeah.
Yes, because the further you are, the chance of that DNA just disappearing in some people or not transferring to some people is just higher, because that is how recombination works. The beauty of more distant cousins, though, is that because of through lines, we can, like, the further you go down on through lines with your more distant relatives, the more matches there are in through lines of DNA matches, because the through lines algorithm can detect possible, like, where in your tree you possibly could match.
All right.
And so once I get down to second great grandparents, all of us, we have considerably more matches in through lines. Like, you can have as many as 50 DNA matches that are distant, but they can see the through lines mechanism can see where somebody's tree connects with yours.
I see. Okay.
You have to, and again, that is just a hint. You have to confirm it yourself because people's trees are not confirmed, even if they're on Ancestry.
Right, right.
Anyway, so I just wanted to show that as an example. And outliers always, when we're doing genetic genealogy, we all have to keep into consideration that outliers are always a possibility.
Well, Julie, I've always said you're an outlier.
I am. And an outlander.
An outlander. You're not a liar. You're not a liar.
I'm not a liar.
But you're an outlier.
I'm not a liar, and I'm not out, but I'm an outlier.
Discuss.
Does that make sense? Yes. Discuss amongst yourselves. All right. I would like to talk about my day at the LA County Archives.
Oh, okay.
I had a little adventure recently, and this all started when I was 15.
This might be a long story.
It shouldn't be. I know. I won't break each year down. So when I was 15 and still living in Australia, my father and my brother and I had to travel for the day from Melbourne to Sydney to go to the U.S. consulate because we were getting green cards because my mother was American. And we had to be interviewed by them and do some kind of oath or something.
Okay.
I don't know. We had to make it. And so as we were sitting there or standing there, I feel like we were standing. I can kind of visualize it now. The auditor or whoever he was said, have either to my father, you or your wife been married before? And my dad was kind of silent for a second. And then he said, well, yes, my wife has been married before.
All right.
This is the first time I had ever heard that.
Oh, wow.
I was 15. I did not know that my mother had been married before.
Wow.
At 15. And I turned and looked at my brother quizzically, and he looked back at me and said, I knew that. Now, of course, my brother's a sociopath, so we can believe that if we want. But
so you don't know if
knows?
he knew it or not?
I don't know if he knew it or not. I don't believe a word that ever comes out.
But you didn't know it.
I certainly did not know it.
Yeah. And we are, of course, like for our listeners, we're talking about your adoptive brother.
My adoptive mother.
And
my adoptive mother. And yes,
brother.
I'm sorry, we're talking about my brother.
Because earlier we'd spoken about your brother.
Correct.
That is your biological brother.
This is yes, that was my biological brother. This is my adoptive brother.
Just to clarify.
Who I am estranged from.
Right.
So that was weird. And I asked my dad about it later when I got up the guts, and he was like, yeah, she doesn't talk about it very much. So at some point, I know I asked her about it, and she was clearly uncomfortable with the subject, and she told me his name, but she didn't want to talk about it.
Okay.
So after my mother died in 2000, my dad and I were having a conversation, and he started getting a little more specific with me about that.
All right.
And he told me that while she had never been specific with him either, that she had told him that he was abusive.
I see.
Which explains
why she didn't want to talk about it.
Yes, yeah. Yes. She once told him that she had to escape by jumping out of a window and getting into a waiting car that her best friend was driving.
Yikes.
Yeah.
That's serious
something.
Stuff. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So then I talked to my mother's niece, who is my cousin, but she's closer to my mother's age, Maudie, and asked her about this, and she confirmed that. And she also said that this man had held a gun to my mother's head and said that he would kill her if she ever learned how to drive a car.
Oh, my God.
Yes, it's shocking. At that moment, my mother made so much more sense to me.
Really?
I don't know if I've ever mentioned this, but my mother never, ever learned how to drive.
No, you didn't mention that. Wow.
She never learned how to drive. She was absolutely terrified of driving. The only time I ever saw her behind the wheel was we were literally in the middle of Australia in the desert. And my dad put her in front of the wheel because there was nobody we could crash into.
And she still managed to kill a koala bear.
So she was absolutely a nervous wreck, and we saw like the dust up ahead, which could have been like 3 or 4 miles ahead. And she insisted that she pull over because she didn't want to. Yeah. So my mother obviously, and my mother, because of that, my mother was absolutely shocked the day I got my driver's license because she thought that I was going to be just like her.
Well,
isn't that weird?
Well, we all project.
Yes, absolutely. Anyway, that made absolute sense to me.
Wow.
So, at some point in the past few years, I built out my mother's family tree, and very quickly did her marriage and divorce show up from this man. So if I had not known about this, which I don't think she ever had any intention of telling me about, it would have shown up in my research and I would have lost my mind. So this guy is in there. I built out his side, and I built out as much as I can. And what I have found out about him is that, well, first of all, at the wedding, my cousin Maudie was a witness. And I also found out that my mother had told me his name, but that was not his real name. He had changed it to anglicize it. And he was born in Kansas City to a couple who were recent immigrants from Russia.
Okay.
And they were Jewish. That also makes more sense to me now.
How so?
Well, I'm not saying that my mother was anti-Semitic, but she certainly, the way she talked to me about Jewish people, told me that she was not 100% comfortable with Jewish people.
Wow.
She just made a point to me that they were different from us. Yeah. And I remember, and we've talked about this before, where how you've got to be taught.
Oh yeah. Carefully taught.
Yeah. Carefully taught. My mother gave me this information without me asking. Like, she told me there was a family that we knew. I think I've talked about this before, on the other side of town. And I liked visiting them because the girls had beautiful, luxurious long hair, and I coveted it. And my mother, and I asked her when we were going to go visit them again, and she told me, they're different from us. And I said, what do you mean they're different from us? And I said, and she said, they're Jewish. I'm like, what does that mean?
I have a good friend who said to me, he was trying to explain his mother's casual anti-Semitism, in that when
yes.
and that the way he kind of picked up on it as a kid was they'd be driving through a nice neighborhood, and she would say, "Oh, look at the lovely homes, isn't this nice? Look at this beautiful. They have a lot of money here." And then she'd be silent, and she would go, "Jewish."
Yes. Yeah.
And he was just, and he said it wasn't sort of a compliment, like, "Oh, look, like it was a good thing." It was a little judgmental, and he, that's how he took it, without her ever saying anything bad about Jewish people. It's amazing the signals you pick up, especially when you're a kid in a car with your mother. So yes.
That's what we call in this day and age microaggressions. So that was me noticing for the first time that somebody had informed me that there are biases against people for no reason other than somebody told me that. You know what I'm saying? So, and I'm not saying, I feel like maybe the fact that he was Jewish, I feel like maybe she had, because of her, she was married to him for almost 15 years.
Wow.
So I feel like she has a certain kind of feeling about Jewish people because he was probably one of the only Jewish people she ever knew. So I remembered that I have a copy of my mother's divorce decree because when I got my original birth certificate, that was in the packet because they needed to show a notarized copy of her divorce decree to prove that she was divorced in order to adopt me. So I had it. And then I remembered, so all I had was that page saying this is when the divorce was final, which was in 1960, a week before my mother and father got married, by the way.
Wow.
Exactly a week. Yeah. And I had the decree. She happened to have been divorced in Los Angeles County. And I was like, well, I know the number even of her divorce. I have the file number. So I decided that I was going to have a day trip to the LA County Archives, which are in the basement of the Los Angeles Superior Court.
Wow.
So I went and I told them this is the number, and they're like, "What do you need?" I'm like, "I need everything except for the decree, the final decree, because that I have, because you have to pay by the page." Yes, and so they had, and it was from 1960, so it was on microfilm. So they gave me a number and told me to sit down, and I had to wait while somebody went and searched for it in the microfilm.
Wow, that's old school.
Yes, that's old school. And they found it, and they called me up and said, "Okay, it's 37 pages.
Okay.
And it's $1 a page." So I paid $37 for this. And they printed it all up, and I got it in my hot little hands and took off and drove out of there because I was paying by the minute for parking. And
this costs more than the divorce.
I know, seriously. And and pulled over to look at it. So the first thing I found was the original, the plaintiff complaint. And it was filed on the basis of extreme cruelty. Which, looking up extreme cruelty, it basically means that someone has threatened your life, or tried to drive you crazy, or gaslighted you,
or beat you,
or beat you. Yeah. Yes, exactly. So, looking through it, I kept trying to see if there was anything that gave actual specific information, and unfortunately, it did not. It did mention that when it shows where he was served, which was at his parents' house. And, but he never responded personally. So he never showed up for the actual trial. And so it was actually my mother and her friend Paul had to provide evidence anyway. But because he never showed up, it was a judgment of divorce by default anyway. But so he didn't show up. But that's all I got. But I find it fascinating that I didn't have to show any evidence that this was my mother.
Right.
At all. So this is public. And also, maybe because it was over 50 years ago, it's just public information. I'm not sure. But they didn't ask me for anything, and I just was able to do this, which was fascinating.
I don't know what the laws are, but whenever somebody secretly got married or like some celebrity, if it's filed in the court, for some reason that becomes like public knowledge. People.
Well, yeah, it's the Freedom of Information Act, I guess.
So I don't know.
But I think it has to be, depending on the state, I think it has to be a certain amount of years before stuff is released and blah, blah, blah. Wow. Anyway. So that was my fun day at the LA County Archives.
It's hard to think of our parents having a life before we knew them, but she had a whole other marriage.
Oh, a whole other marriage, a long marriage.
Yeah.
And my mother, like I said, I've talked before, we did not have a mother-daughter bond. It was just never there for various reasons, obviously. And my mother, and I do, because of knowing this stuff, as I said, it explains so much about my mother's, her affect, I guess, in life, and the fact that she rarely left the house and didn't understand much about me, and had very set in stone ideas about certain principles that she believed to be fact in the world.
And now you're probably, I'm assuming you're learning more about your mother even after she's gone, which I think is really
I know more about my mother now than I ever did when she was living.
So interesting.
Which is sad, really.
I don't know if it's sad, maybe a little, but I feel like just because someone dies, our relationship with that person continues.
Yeah.
My mom is gone now almost 20 years, but I still have a relationship with her, because she's still part of my life,
of course,
even if she's not here. So and the way I feel about her changes depending on what's going on in my life. So I find that part of your story, or that aspect, fascinating, that you're still searching it out and learning about her.
I still want to, I am interested in what makes people who they are, which is why I'm so interested in genealogy. And I think that happened because I'm adopted, and because so much is out there when you know where to find it.
Well, thanks for sharing that, Julie. Let's take a break.
Okay.
Thank you for listening to CutOff Genes with Julie Dixon Jackson and Richard Castle. You can support us by going to patreon.com/CutOff Genes podcast. Now, back to the program.
Okay, it is time for part 2 of my conversation with adoptee Lynn Grubb. When we last heard from Lynn, she had found her biological mother. This was before DNA, but they were estranged mainly because her mother told her one day that she should be grateful that she wasn't aborted, which is something that is said on a daily basis to adoptees on the internet.
Yikes.
Yikes. Anyway, she has since moved on and was working on DNA. She'd done DNA. She'd found a third cousin, and we're going to go back and take it from there.
Great. Let's listen in.
All right.
So years pass, and then in 2019, I get a third cousin match at 23andMe.
Okay.
But this woman isn't from Colombia. She's American. She lives in D.C., but her roots are in Peru.
Okay.
And it's the closest match I have. So my team and I build out a tree, and it pretty much leads to nowhere. At some point, the records just stop.
Yeah.
So we don't know what to do with that. 2020, I get a second cousin match at Ancestry, who is the mother of the third cousin match I got at 23andMe.
Okay.
And she has a very unique surname.
Okay.
And I'm like, this has got to be the match. This is it. Like, in my gut, I knew this was going to be it. So I took that surname and I ran it through Ancestry's yearbooks, and I found this guy who was in college next to my birth mom at the right time, right place. And I thought, well, maybe this is him.
That's a really good clue. What do you mean by in college next to your birth mom?
Like in the same area.
Oh, okay.
Not at the same college.
But a college nearby. Okay.
In the college that the best friend mentioned they met at this party.
Oh, my gosh.
Okay.
Thank
that was
God
another
for that
thing.
Best friend. That was a really great hint.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's funny because she was very forthcoming with Greg, and he wrote her a follow-up letter, and my husband followed up. Because again, chicken.
Yeah.
And so he called her and she backpedaled. She's like, oh no, I don't remember any of that.
Uh-huh.
So we were like, okay, well, thank God she was forthcoming in the beginning.
At some point, right.
Yeah. So that's, let's see,
So you got the match and you found this guy whose name was Julio?
No.
Okay.
It was not, but he shared the same surname as my closest match.
All
and
right.
My next search angel, she was looking at my matches and saying, based on other matches I had, she was pretty sure that this was a paternal, like a father's match.
Okay.
So we thought, it could be the surname.
Yeah.
So that's how we came up with this guy. And his name was Antonio.
Okay.
Again, built his tree. It died. Couldn't find things because this guy was from Peru.
Right.
Family Search only has so much, and just couldn't find much on the guy.
Right.
So he had a Facebook page and a LinkedIn, and so I stalked his Facebook page. Friend requested him, and nothing happened. Yeah,
right.
We're professional stalkers, right?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. We have to own that.
Yeah, right. I own it. So months passed, and I just kind of concluded the guy was dead because there was nothing going on.
No
on
activity
his Facebook
at all.
Page. Yeah. So I decided to write a letter and message all of his Facebook friends.
Uh-huh.
So I did that, and one of his relatives responded. She spoke mainly Spanish, but she did have some broken English. And she said, I don't know if he's alive, but last I knew he was living in Honduras. And I said, okay, well, how are you related to him? And she said, well, he's my grandmother's brother. And I'm like, and your grandmother's name is? Mm-hmm. And so she told me the name. So that helped with the tree.
Right.
She explained that my DNA matches, we shared a grandfather, but not a grandmother. And we ended up being half first cousins.
Oh, okay.
So I didn't know about the second marriage, which is why we couldn't build the tree any further and link Antonio to the tree.
Yeah.
So as soon as we got that new bit of information, we were able to fill in the tree and connect this guy to me. Well, to my closest match, I should say, which then inevitably connected him to me.
Right, which proved that your relationship to that person, he could definitely be your father.
Absolutely.
Wow.
So she was his niece, my second cousin Match, who ended up being a half first cousin.
Gotcha.
You know how Ancestry says we estimate at second cousin, but based on the tree, she's half first cousin.
Right.
And she was really wonderful. She's so funny. She's so much a truth teller. And then I'm like, oh my God, I finally meet someone in this family who I'm like.
Yay.
You know, yes. I know. She just told it like it was.
A bingo moment, isn't it? When you find you weed through everybody and you're like, oh, that's good. There's something.
My God, she did not sugarcoat him at all.
Okay.
She's like, yeah, I only met him a couple times. Once was to pick him up from his nose job surgery at the hospital. I'm like, really? And I'm like, I said, well, I asked her one day, I'm like, how much did he weigh? Because I only have like 2 pictures of him and you can't see his body.
Yeah.
And she's like, oh, he was really chubby. Didn't you notice he had that huge double chin?
Oh my gosh.
And I'm like, well, thank God this explains my weight, because I'm like heavier than either of my birth parents, but I kind of suspected maybe I had some other relatives that were, on the heavier side.
That it was a genetic thing. Yeah. Yeah.
We'll blame the genes, right?
Well, I mean, it is a thing, though.
It is.
It absolutely is. Yeah.
Uh-huh. So, yeah, she was just hilarious. And so she told me what she knew about him, which was very little, because he was the kind of family member that like left the family and didn't really talk to anyone.
Right.
So I didn't get a whole lot of information from her, but at least I finally had the answer. And that was 2020 during the pandemic.
Okay.
Well, unfortunately, he lived in Canada, and I couldn't get out of the country at that point.
Wait, he lived in Canada?
Yeah, he was living in Canada.
Okay.
Yeah, he'd been there since the 1980s.
All right.
He was a professor, and he also had a home in Honduras, which is where I eventually found my sister.
Oh.
I noticed a bunch of pictures of a baby and a little girl on his Facebook page. And I thought maybe that was his granddaughter, but it turned out to be his daughter.
Okay.
So she was the same age as my daughter. So she's 18.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And he's old. So I learned he liked younger women.
Oh, shocker. Shocker.
I know. And that plastic surgery he did, that kind of continued later into his life. So he was always trying to, make himself look better.
Right.
And so, I never got to talk to him. He has a son, and also in Canada, who's with a son the same age as me. And I suspect that is the reason why this was a big secret.
Yeah. Is he still living?
No, he died in 2021.
Oh, okay. Oh,
sadly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I was really hoping to at least get to talk to him on the phone, but he had dementia by the time I could call him. My sister gave me his number, and his caregiver wouldn't put him on the phone, and he was he just really wasn't with it by then. Yeah. I don't know if he was purposefully avoiding me or if he just didn't have the wherewithal.
Too. Yeah.
What is it?
Well, because dementia. I mean, even if he did know who you were, he could easily say, "I'm so sorry. I don't know who you
exactly.
I don't remember."
Exactly.
Oh, wow.
So anyway, so that's basically the story.
Have you met either of your siblings in person?
Nope.
Are you planning on it?
Well, I would have to go to Honduras to meet my sister,
right.
So I don't think that's going to be happening anytime soon.
Sure.
And my brother lives in Vancouver, and he ignores my calls. So
yes,
probably not happening.
Gotcha. Yeah, I have a sister who doesn't who doesn't recognize me either.
Yeah,
just pretends
it's hard.
That I don't exist. I mean, again, it's in it's in Australia, so it's doesn't really affect me. And I have, 3 brothers as well on that side. One of whom is the one who tested for me, who was amazing. So,
that's funny that we both have international family members.
Yes.
So, yeah. That distance really does help, like mentally and emotionally. I was like, well, they're way over there and I can't leave the country. And
Yeah,
well,
it's almost like a little gift, isn't it? Even though, I mean, I
is.
absolutely want to meet my brothers. I have an overwhelming, and I was supposed to. He was on his way here when COVID hit.
Yeah.
So I'm going to. But there's
Good.
still that whole other, I don't know. I think the reunion hasn't been as weird for me emotionally, I think, because of the distance.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's true of me too. I think, I don't know, most of us meet our birth moms first, right?
Yep.
And that's when all the emotional stuff happens. So by the time I found my father, I had a huge support network.
Yep.
I just was so better prepared for that reality.
Yes.
And even though I didn't get
And
to
we're
meet him,
older when we know more what
Yeah.
to, yeah. I've talked about this before that I met my mother when I was 22 and I was so like fresh off the boat and still in the fog and just like anything she told me, I was like, cool. Yeah, that's great. I'm good. You know what I mean? Nothing hit me like it would hit me now if it was the first time I heard it. If that makes sense.
Totally.
Yeah.
My mother told me I would have kept you had your father been my boyfriend. And that hit me really hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what my mother told me?
What?
She told me that she was actually engaged. She got married 3 months after I was given up, after I was born. And she said that they just didn't know if John could raise somebody else's child.
Oh.
So it was like literally she chose a husband over a child.
Yeah.
Which is hard. And I remember at the time thinking, yeah, okay, that makes sense. Sure, fair enough. But the more I think about it, I'm like, oh, that's deep.
Yeah.
That's heavy. Especially having kids of my own now and realize the thought of making that kind of choice is crazy to me.
Well, yeah, and I'm a kinship adoptive parent.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, I've raised somebody else's child.
Right.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And now I think about some of the things she said to me that I would never in a million years say to my daughter.
Yes.
It's just, it's more shocking in hindsight because I'm like, what was this lady thinking?
Yeah.
When she said these things.
Yeah. It was a different time. That's what we have to keep telling ourselves.
I guess. Yeah. We fortunately did not live in that time, but we were definitely affected by it. Right?
Yes, absolutely, directly.
Yeah.
Okay, Lynn, thanks for talking to me. Can you tell people how they can find you, how they can read your book or listen to your book, and all of the other things?
Yes, you don't even have to buy my book; it's free.
That's awesome.
Go to the Adopted Genealogist on Instagram, or you can just type Lynn Grubb and adoption in Google, and you'll find my blog, which will link you. I'm on Spotify and a couple of the others. I would love for anyone to get in touch and let me know if the memoir moved them in any way or if they have any further questions. I would love that. And thank you so much for having me today.
Well, thanks for being here. I really appreciate it. We finally made it. We finally did it.
We did it. So nice to meet you, Julie. I'm sure I'll see you on TikTok.
All right. Thank you so much, Lynn, for talking to me. As always, an interesting story.
Thank you, Lynn. I am Richard Castle, and you can find out more about my work when I'm not on this podcast at my website, richardcastle.com, or you can follow me on Twitter or on Facebook or Instagram at Castle Songs.
I'm Julie Dixon Jackson. Find me at cutoffjeans.com and on all the socials. Subscribe, rate, and review this podcast, please. It would really help us. And also, if I have worked for you or done any work for you and you are happy with my work, please find a place to review my company because that also helps my visibility. And if you need help, reach out to me. I am ready, willing, and able to help everybody.
Sounds great. I think you should tell everybody what we always tell people at the end of this podcast, Julie.
We always tell people that the truth is in your genes.